Hello and welcome to Anti-Natalism this week. We have 5 selected stories to discuss, so let's get started. A new article by David Benatar, Does It Matter If What I Do Doesn't Make a Difference, was published on Oxford University Press's blog. The article doesn't directly discuss antinatalism, but I saw an interesting analogy. Let's first examine Benatar's original argument and then we can explore the connection to antinatalism. Sometimes it feels like our individual actions don't really matter. Benatar highlights 2 examples of this. First, he discusses what he calls moral vegetarians, those who abstain from eating meat because they believe it harms animals. However, one person avoiding meat won't make any difference in the massive meat and dairy industry. Yet, while a single act of eating meat may seem insignificant, the collective impact of such actions causes immense harm. This issue is known as causal inefficacy. The second example of causal inefficacy that Benatar presents involves carbon emissions. If I take a flight, that single flight won't on its own trigger greenhouse gas effect. But when millions of people take flights, the cumulative emissions result in serious environmental damage. So we can have 2 cases of causal inefficacy. In both, the individual action appears inconsequential, but in aggregation, the harm becomes substantial. However, as Benatar points out, there is a key difference in how the inefficacy arises. In case of carbon emissions, the harm arises only as we scale up the emissions. If your flight was the only one, there really would be no problem. Global warming only results from the aggregation of flights and other emissions. Here, an individual action is harmless in isolation, but harm emerges when many people do the same thing. By contrast, in the case of eating meat, the harm is obscured as one scales up. When an individual meat meal requires killing an animal, the causal connection between the harm and the meal is patent, meaning it is obvious. That connection becomes obscured when meat production reaches industrial proportions. This obscurity arises because meat eating is normalized. The harm is inherent in the individual action. We just fail to see it because everyone does it. Now, Benatar doesn't discuss this in the article, but I see a loose analogy to antinatalism. There is a parallel between ethical antinatalism and environmental antinatalism. In the case of environmental antinatalism, the damage caused by adding a new human consumer only becomes evident in aggregation. A single birth doesn't directly harm the environment, but collectively, more people lead to greater environmental destruction. But with ethical antinatalism, the harm isn't hidden in aggregation. It's present in the suffering of the individual child. The harm is immediate and undeniable in that person's experience. However, because procreation is so normalized, this harm is overlooked. Most people procreate because most people procreate. The same argument was also discussed in a recent interview with David Benatar on channel The Dissenter. The interview focused mainly on his new book, The Very Practical Ethics, which means ethics that deal with everyday life and concerns of ordinary people. Now, the book itself is not about antinatalism, and neither was the interview, but the topic did come up a few times. While discussing different views on sex, Benatar explained the reproductive view held by some conservatives. According to this view, sex is only morally permissible if there is possibility of reproduction, which means gay sex, for example, would not be allowed. Benatar, on the other hand, holds an anti-reproductive view. Sex is only morally permissible when it does not lead to reproduction. No surprise there. Speaking of David Benatar's interviews, Lawrence Anton has also interviewed him about the very practical ethics. That interview should be out soon, hopefully sooner, so we can review it in the next week. Here's some news from another David Pearce. He recently gave a talk titled Blueprint for Pan-Species Welfare State, Genome Reform, AI, and the Biohappiness Revolution. This was at the AI for Animals gathering in Berkeley, California on March 1st and 2nd. David Pearce is a soft antinatalist and therefore a transhumanist philosopher. He believes that hard antinatalism, like Benatarian antinatalism, is logically correct but will not have a practical impact in the real world. So instead, he argues that we should focus on eliminating or reducing potential suffering. That is why one of the early slides in his talk states, "This talk outlines how genome reform and AI can replace the biology of pain and suffering with a more civilized signaling system." It was a very interesting talk, and the recording will be available soon. An article titled "Be Fruitful but Do Not Multiply" by Nathaniel Stagg is now available on Phil Papers. I'm not sure about its exact publication date, but it seems to be part of an upcoming issue of the Faith and Philosophy Journal. Nathaniel presents an interesting argument connecting theism and antinatalism. But before diving into it, let's understand some background. In the past, philosophers have argued that if you believe in heaven and hell, and if you accept that some people are condemned to eternal suffering, then there is always a non-zero chance that your child could end up in such a hell. So when deciding whether to have children, you are essentially gambling with the possibility that your child might suffer eternally. That's why some have argued that the rational choice would be not to have children at all. This is a risk-based argument. There is some probability, however small, that your child could go to hell, so you weigh that risk against the potential benefits. Now, even though these probabilities are not precise, we use similar risk-based decisions in our everyday lives. For example, there is a non-zero probability that I could die in a road accident, but I weigh that risk against the benefits of driving. If the risk is very low and the benefits are high, I decide to drive. However, if there's a severe weather warning in my area and I want to go for a long drive just for fun, then the risk outweighs the benefit and it would be rational not to drive. That was just my example. Nathaniel does not use this analogy, but it helps to illustrate that we don't always need exact probabilities to make calculated decisions. A rough estimate of risks is often enough. And so even if there is some risk of a child going to hell, if the probability is low enough compared to the benefits of having that child, one could still justify reproduction. However, in the case of heaven and hell, Nathaniel points out a crucial problem. Before having a child, we don't actually know the probabilities at all, not even an approximate range. This means that the decision to have children is not just a risky decision, it is a decision under uncertainty, a situation where probabilities are completely unknown, and for such decisions, risk calculations don't apply. So, what should we do instead? Nathaniel turns to the work of John Rawls, a political philosopher famous for his veil of ignorance thought experiment. Imagine you're designing a society, but you don't know anything about your future in it. You don't know your race, gender, wealth, social class, or talents. Since you could end up anywhere in this society, the rational choice would be to design it in a way that maximizes the well-being of the worst of individuals. This idea is called Maximin principle. Maximize the minimum possible outcome. Nathaniel applies this principle to the decision of having children. Since we don't know the probabilities of a child going to heaven or hell, we should use the Maximin approach instead of risk-based calculations. That leaves us with three possible scenarios. 1. We have a child and she goes to hell. 2. We don't have a child, meaning no one goes to heaven or hell. And 3. We have a child and she goes to heaven. Now, applying the Maximin principle, the rational choice would be to not have a child at all. This ensures the worst possible outcome, that is eternal suffering, is avoided. There is of course some cost to parents in terms of lost experiences, but that loss is still far better than the risk of a child suffering for eternity. And this, according to Nathaniel, supports antinatalism. Now, in Nathaniel Stagg's case, the Maximin principle was used by potential parents to decide whether or not to have children. Interestingly, David Benatar applies a similar argument in Better Never to Have Been, but from the perspective of the potential child, the one who would come into existence. Imagine that potential people are sitting behind the veil of ignorance, deciding what the population of the real world should be. By the way, this sitting behind the veil is called the original position in Rawlsian philosophy. Since these potential people have no idea whether they would be born into good lives or terrible ones, they would also apply this Maximin principle, choosing the option that minimizes the worst possible outcome. Benatar puts it this way: as long as procreation continues, some of those people who are brought into being will lead lives that are not worth living. The only way to improve their position is not to bring such people into existence, and the only way to guarantee that such people are not brought into existence is not to bring anybody into into existence. That's why he says if we admit possible people to the original position, we find that the chosen principles would produce my ideal population 0. I find it fascinating how so many different arguments can be applied in so many different ways in antinatalism. There was a paper titled Future People as Future Victims, an antinatalist justification of long-termism by Rex Lee. It offers a unique perspective on our moral responsibility toward future generations. This paper brings together antinatalism and long-termism, two ideas that are usually seen as opposing ideas. Rex Lee builds on Schifrin's consent argument and takes it a step further. The consent argument states that when we have children, those children never consented to being born, so bringing them into existence is already a moral wrong. On the other hand, long-termism is the view that the long-term future should be our key moral priority. It argues that we should act in ways that prioritize the well-being of future generations. Typically, long-termism focuses on improving future lives, but Rex Lee suggests that antinatalism can inform this view in two ways. One, future generations can be seen as victims of the consent argument, born without their consent, so improving their well-being could serve as a compensation. And two, doing so could also weaken the severity of consent argument. However, there seems to be a circular logic here, bringing people into existence just so we can compensate for the harm of bringing them into existence. But I could be mistaken. My understanding is based only on the abstract of this paper, as the full text is behind a paywall. Maybe once we gain access to the full paper, we can revisit this discussion. That's all for this week's updates. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.